How's that? Does that work?
Perfect.
Good. So first of all, I want to thank the folks from No Common Core, Maine for setting up this event, and in particular I want to thank Heidi Sampson and Anne-Marie Banfield, who really started coming up with this idea for the event back in the summer. And I think they've done a really, really terrific job. They've gotten folks from all over the country and moms in particular that really have led a lot of the pushback against Common Core. So let's give them all My name is Jamie Gass. I'm director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute. Pioneer Institute is a Boston-based think tank, so we're a research organization. We're a 501c3. We don't accept any public money for the work that we do. We've been around for about 20-some-odd years. We are completely independent and nonpartisan. 75–80% of the funding comes from private donors, and Pioneer has not accepted any money at all from foundations or deep-pocketed donors for the work that we've done on Common Core. It really has afforded us an enormous amount of independence to really call it like we see it. So I want to give you a little bit of sort of the context of how we got to this point where we're having meetings all over the country about national standards, and it's having, I think, the kind of proper public hearing and debate that it probably should have had 4 years or so ago. I think the Founding Fathers were very wise. They understood that the federal government has proper jurisdictions and responsibilities, things like trade and foreign policy and defense. But then when it comes to the domestic matters that most intimately touch the lives of citizens, and in particular parents and children, that the states really are the proper authority. They call this idea federalism, this balance of authority and jurisdiction. Even at this late date, where the growth of the federal government over the last 50 years in K-12 education has been kind of creeping forward, 90% of the funding of K-12 education is paid for by the states and localities, and by law and by tradition, and by, of course, by funding, the states were always intended to really control the work around K-12 education. The Founding Fathers understood that public education should serve as a wellspring for our republic and for democracy. And in order for that to occur, the citizens and the people that are doing the work and the people that know best about the appropriateness of education for their children should be driven by parents and teachers and people at the local level, not bureaucrats in thousands of miles away who have never, in some instances, been to some of these states. And I would argue that arrangement, this federalism, this balance of state and federal authority, is something that has actually served this country very well. Really, over the last several hundred years, we've gone from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to the most powerful country in the world. It's no small accomplishment, and I think there's a lot of wisdom, legal, political wisdom, that are embedded in our Constitution, right? That said, there's no question that gradually through the 20th century, this country went from being among the higher performing countries in the world to dropping quite dramatically to 17th or 20th by national and international measures, right? But yeah, this really the conversation began really in the late 1950s with Sputnik 1 and the space race. There was a lot of concern that we weren't going to have the math and science and technological abilities to compete with the first the Soviet Union, but then really by the early 1980s, with A Nation at Risk, which was a report that was commissioned by the Reagan administration, it talked about how we are losing our edge competitively with countries like Japan and Germany, and in order to compete in the 21st century, we had to improve the quality of our public education. What that Nation at Risk report did not do in 1983 was come up with lots of top-down prescriptions from Washington, D.C. on how to fix it, because really, even at that time, everybody across the political spectrum has always known that K-12 education is the proper jurisdictions of states and localities, that the feds really can't fix it as a practical matter. The problem is that around that time, maybe a little earlier, but around that time, there's always been this group of people and institutional players in Washington, D.C. Universities talked a little bit about them. I'm going to explain it a little bit. National Governors Association, which represents governors, not states. the Council of Chief State School Officers, which represents commissioners of education, but not states. Achieve Inc., which was a spin-off nonprofit connected with the Governors Association. A lot of these, they call them the Beltway Bandits, or Bill Bennett, the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan, called it the Blob. These Washington, D.C.-based trade groups have long felt that the way to resolve the problems in K-12 education is to have national standards, testing, and curriculum. Some of them even go further than that. Really what they've always wanted to do is have a more workforce development model for K-12 education. So unlike what the founding fathers, people like Jefferson and Adams and others thought that K-12 education is supposed to be a wellspring for citizenship and for democracy, they say, no, no, no. In order to compete with Germany and Japan and Hong Kong and Singapore and China and India, you need to have a centralized workforce development system. It's a fundamentally different outlook for K-12 education that has been embodied in the whole history of the country and by most of the prominent political figures. But nonetheless, these folks believe this. They earnestly believe it. They really think this is, if you stack up the national standards, testing, and curriculum, that you're going to have some wonderful ability to compete with the rest of the world. My state, Massachusetts, really took a different tact in 1993. We elected a Republican governor named Bill Weld, who was a pretty moderate to liberal Republican, and he worked with a guy named Tom Birmingham, who was a pretty liberal Democrat. He had a great relationship with organized labor. Mark Roosevelt, who's the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, he too was a pretty liberal Democrat with great relationships with organized labor. And what these three men did in Massachusetts was craft the landmark 1993 Education Reform Act. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, and I'm not telling you about it by way of bragging about Massachusetts. I'm sure folks in Maine and New Hampshire hear enough about people from Massachusetts. But the reality is that it's something that state government in Massachusetts did quite well. And in truth, there are really two discussions that are going on in this country. There's a lot of the things that Massachusetts did back in the early 90s, which has contributed to some remarkable achievements. And there's really, various degrees of stagnation and decline that we're seeing elsewhere. So what these group of politicians did in 1993 was they sat down and crafted this ed reform law. Really what it is a grand bargain. And it made for not only good politics, but good for good policy as well. And the deal was that they were going to put a great deal of additional financial resources into the system, and Massachusetts, at the state and local level, has spent more than $100 billion, that's billion with a B, in exchange for all of the difficult things that many of the players around K-12 education had not wanted to do over the previous decades. So, first and foremost, they were going to have a state test, which we call the MCAS test. It's a high-stakes test so that when students graduate, that the diploma means something, right? But it's not just the test, because testing in itself is no panacea, right? We've all taken tests, some of them are good ones and some of them are bad ones. What the test was based on was really quite different from what had been the kind of fads that had been plagued in K-12 education for the previous decades, and I think had contributed to the decline that the country had experienced. But specifically, it was going to redirect the conversation to academics. I know that's a sort of revolutionary idea that schools would be focusing on academics, but at that time, it was a big deal. English, math, science, history. Those were the core academic areas they were going to focus on. Specifically in English, they were going to redirect the conversation away from sort of soft skills and self-esteem, and they were going to redirect it, and you're going to be fortunate enough to hear this afternoon from Sandy Stotsky, who was one of the architects of this, is that, ironically enough, kids in English class were going to be reading history, literature, poetry, and drama, right? Not soft skills, not self-esteem, not lots of fuzzy text, not lots of poor quality text. It turns out that, reading Huckleberry Finn and reading Sherlock Holmes and reading Edith Wharton and Dickens and all of these texts, the quality of the vocabulary and the sentence structure in it is just better than what had been going on for a long time. Those of you who benefited from education decades ago, you can remember that this is what was taught in English class, right? So Massachusetts is going to return to that. In the area of mathematics, we emulated the high-performing countries in the world, so the Hong Kongs and the Singapores and the South Korea, and we made sure that kids had access to Algebra 1 in 8th grade. Algebra 1 is the gateway for all higher level mathematics. You're never going to get into the science, technology, engineering, or mathematics fields in college. They call those STEM. If you don't start early enough, and the way to do that, and Dr. Stotsky and others ensured that this happened, and Professor Milgram from Stanford University did the same thing in California, Algebra 1 in 8th grade. And this was the kind of cornerstone of the math standards in Massachusetts. There were teacher testing that were aligned with the academic standards, so that the students and the teachers were being tested on the same kinds of academic material. And it was really a kind of a model, this ed reform law that I'm talking about. It was a real model of accountability for everybody in the entire system. So it's money in exchange for high academic standards, testing, and accountability throughout the whole system. Well, the results really have been quite remarkable. I mean, when the Race to the Top came out, which is this federal grant program which was pushing Common Core, came out in 2009, they call it Race to the Top. Well, you know, with some degree of pride, Massachusetts saying it's the race to become Massachusetts. And so when the Race to the Top came out, Massachusetts by 2005 was already #1 in the country in the NAEP test. The NAEP test is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's called the Nation's Report Card. It's been around for about 35 or 40 years. No state in the history of the test has ever been #1 in every grade tested and every category tested. And in 2005, Massachusetts did it. And then it did it again in 2007, 2009, 2011, and more recently in 2013. I say that it's the equivalent of winning the World Series several times in a row and doing it in 4 names straight each time. But as the Nation at Risk mapped out in 1983, it's not just competing with other states. If you are going to be competing in the global economy, you need to be competing internationally. And that's what the Nation at Risk talked an awful lot about. So in 2007 and in 2013, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country. It was one of only a handful of states to do this. And our 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science in 2007, and we were in the top 4 or 5 in the world in mathematics. The architects of the ed reform law, again, Republicans and Democrats, this exceeded their wildest expectations. They never thought this was going to be possible. But it was, again, it was the far-sighted lawmaking of these state legislators and governors, coupled with the outstanding work of people like Sandy Stotsky, that really made this happen. And it's a hard-won game. So in 2009, when the Race to the Top came down, and the Obama administration was using this $4.3 billion from Race to the Top to incentivize states to adopt the Common Core, which was being developed, as you heard earlier, by the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, we said, hey, hold the phone here. We're already #1. We've got the most to lose here. So what we did, Pioneer Institute, is enlisted the help of Sandy Stotsky and Jim Milgram and from Stanford University, and Zev Werman, who's a Silicon Valley engineer who had worked on the high-quality math standards in California. And what they did is these researchers sat down in 40, 50-page crosswalks of each of the drafts. There's 4 drafts of Common Core that got to the final. But we looked at each draft of those standards, and what they determined was that Common Core was of significantly lower quality than what high standard states like Massachusetts and California and Texas and Indiana and Minnesota and others already had. So it wasn't going to be a race to the top. It was looking early on like this was going to be a race to the middle. And I think the more we have dug into this and we've done additional papers on it, it's become clearer and clearer that these are not very good standards. Specifically, the Common Core folks who frankly had no experience developing state standards before, most of them had never taught before, they had very little experience in K-12 education at all. They ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and other high standard states, and they decided to cut classic literature, poetry, and drama by about 60%. Which is, there's, you know, as Sandy talks a lot about, there's really no research basis for the efficacy of that policy decision, but that is precisely what they've done. In the area of mathematics, same thing. They ignored the evidence from all the high standard states and high standard countries and high performing countries, And they move Algebra 1 forward, not from 8th grade, but into early 9th grade. They also use an experimental form of geometry that has never been successful in any place it's been tried, including the former Soviet Union. Professor Milgram outlines how Common Core really stopped at what he calls Algebra 2 Light. So if your child is interested in STEM, in the science and technology, engineering, mathematics fields, Common Core is really a path to nowhere. Because these other previous state standards may not have tested it, but at least they had pre-calculus, calculus, trigonometry, which is a kind of a roadmap to get to those STEM fields. So they ignored all the evidence, and not surprisingly, people that had no experience in developing K-12 standards before didn't come up with very good standards. We've done additional research where drilling down even further on the loss of poetry. We've done another paper just this spring with Ralph Ketchum, who's probably the preeminent James Madison scholar in the last 50, 60 years. And he talks about even though they shift in English language arts to what they call informational text or history, the way in which they do it is very dangerous. So I think we can all agree that reading the Gettysburg Address or a letter from Birmingham jail, these are important texts for kids to learn. They're not very valuable, though, to kids if they forget and are instructed by Common Core and its advocates to forget all the historical context. So you're supposed to forget that it happens in the middle of the Civil War. You're supposed to forget that President Lincoln was consecrating a cemetery. In the instance of MLK, you're supposed to forget that it happens in 1963 in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. You're supposed to, I suppose, forget that it's written from a jail. And he makes it clear that that this is not really the way to go. So we've looked at additional pieces of research too, and in the area of the legality, because people across the political spectrum have known for decades that there are federal laws, and there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits funding, directing, national standards, testing, or curriculum. Specifically, there's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson. There's the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon. And then there was the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself, which was signed by President Carter, all prohibiting the federal government from doing national standards testing and curriculum, which is precisely what has happened through Common Core. And states adopted through the federal grant program and the 2 testing consortia. My state, Massachusetts, is in the PARC test, and New Hampshire and Maine are in the Smarter Balance. These have been funded directly by the federal government. This is a violation of law. The next piece of research that we looked at is the cost, because even though the Gates Foundation has pumped over $200 million into Common Core, very few governors, very few boards of ed, very few departments of education, very few legislatures have had bills or hearings or any cost-benefit analysis of this. So we got a researcher with a lot of experience both on Capitol Hill but also in states. And he came up with a figure of about $16 billion. And again, this is $16 billion that the states and localities are going to pick up the tab on, because 90% of the funding in this country for K-12 education is paid for by the states and localities. So this is a giant, really unfunded mandate. There's other pieces of research, and I can talk a little bit about those maybe in the Q&A. We've done a lot of work on the data mining more recently, which runs parallel to Common Core. That's an issue that is a great deal of concern to parents and moms in particular. The U.S. Department of Education has really brushed aside the FERPA laws. These are parental privacy laws. And they've brushed those aside because they have created a federal incentive for states to gather not just academic data, but personally identifiable data on children and their families through this what they call longitudinal data collection. And this is something that the Obama administration and the advocates of Common Core, they've wanted these kinds of data for forever. And the reason why is that if you're building a kind of workforce development system out of Washington, D.C., you got to have lots and lots of information, not just on whether Johnny or Julie are reading at the right level for 3rd grade, but all kinds of other information. I've given you a ton of information. You're going to be hearing from a lot of other folks. The good news on all this is that from the beginning, Texas said that they're not doing it. They did what most states should have done. They said, don't mess with Texas, right? And they used that as an opportunity to get Sandy Stotsky and to get Jim Milgram down there. They probably have the best academic standards in the country at this point. And there's tons and tons of pushback going on all over the place. You'll hear from some of the moms and some of the parents from across the country, whether it's Indiana or Oklahoma or others, that have been pulling out. This is an enormous movement. I'm not just saying that because we're working on it. It really is a real tribute to the hard work of a lot of moms and grassroots activists that have really gotten themselves educated. And so, again, I'm really grateful. I know I've given you a lot of information. There's a lot of details to it, but I really appreciate the folks who set up this event. I appreciate you all taking your time to come out and listen. So thanks again. I appreciate it.